Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed their break and had, like I did, a Brella blind date. It was very nice. Got to know a very interesting person, and we talked a lot about very interesting things. And I'm not going to go into more detail. So we're going to have a lightning talk by my good colleague, Ian Miell. Is it Miell or Miell?
It's Miell, but no one gets it right, don't worry.
Jamie never gets it right. Jamie, you're mispronouncing Ian's name. Anyway, so Ian is a cloud native consultant at Container Solutions, and he has over 20 years of experience in IT, writing, running, architecting, and maintaining software for some of the world's busiest systems. Sorry. So he's also the author of a couple of books that you might have read. One is Docker in Practice, or maybe Learn Bash, Git, Terraform the Hard Way. Also, he's doing a lot of training courses, videos. So, I mean, if you enjoy learning, then you might have met Ian before. And he also runs a blog with the very German word Zwischenzugs. You'll have to go to his site or Twitter I'm not going to spell it out now. So, yeah, right now we work together and we help companies change to cloud native ways of working, which I just grabbed off your bio. And he will also tell you a little bit more about himself and his non-obsession with Star Wars. So, Ian, if you're ready.
Yep.
Cool. Then take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Leanne, for the introduction. I genuinely am not a fan of Star Wars, which makes this talk quite misleading. But I'm here to talk about mainly cloud-native transformation through a couple of lenses that may be of interest. I didn't do much with the costume, but I did manage to get a rabbit on my head. I don't know if you can see that. And I got my Drink Me bottle. So that's my last-minute effort for the Alice theme. But this is going to talk about Star Wars a lot. So who am I? If you want to contact me, my handle's at Ian Miell. As Leanne mentioned, I've been a software engineer for over 20 years, doing straightforward software stuff, writing and maintaining. But then I moved into cloud native transformation recently, having spent about 5 years working in cloud native transformations in other companies, small, medium, and large. So I spent a lot of time working with companies that are needing to change. And as a result, I became more and more interested in group psychology. And that's what I'm going to sort of try and relate things to today. I'm going to quickly summarize the argument I want to make in this talk. So basically, the argument I want to make is that companies are like individuals, can be viewed like individuals. And companies can have imposter syndrome too. And this syndrome, thirdly, this syndrome, I argue, hides a deeper pathology that needs surfacing if you want to change. I actually Googled corporate imposter syndrome and came up with 0 results. So it's clearly something that people haven't talked about, or not many people have thought about talking about. So as part of this argument, I'm going to make an analogy to Star Wars and talk a little bit about a huge subject, which is Kleinian psychoanalysis. Hopefully it might resonate with some people here, and if it does, I'd be delighted to hear it if you got in touch. Okay, so I'm going to assume that most people know what imposter syndrome is. It's talked about a lot in our industry. And since the concept of corporate imposter syndrome doesn't seem to have been defined, I've put a definition here, which is simply taking the normal imposter syndrome definition and replacing it with 2 well-placed companies. And basically it means that when companies look at other companies, they tend to, I've observed many of them tend to think that other companies have things sorted out, whereas themselves do not. And particularly this is true if they brought in a company like ours to help them with a cloud native transformation. There tends to be this terrible sense of we are terrible and these other companies are really good and have it all figured out, and we don't know what we're doing. And I've seen this all the time, not only as a consultant, but also as when I was working in banks and in small and medium and larger companies. So who is to blame for this corporate imposter syndrome? Well, it's easy to blame other companies So it would be very, very easy to say, oh, it's just because those guys give talks at conferences that say they've got everything figured out. They wrote blog posts that tell you how to do things, and they project this air of competence about them. The canonical example of this might be considered to be the Spotify model, which was, swept through the industry about, I think it was about 5-6 years ago, maybe longer. And suddenly everyone was talking about tribes, squads, and trio. And discussion of this kind of assumed that Spotify had got it all figured out, and we just had to copy what they did, and everything would be fine. So it's easy to do that, but the reality of this problem is far more complicated. And interestingly, Spotify themselves tried to get across that the story wasn't that simple. Wrote several blogs about this and tried to communicate this, but were completely ignored. And I think one of the reasons for this is that we, the audience who receive this message and propagate it amongst ourselves, are just as much to blame, if not more, than those companies that try and project this image. And the reason for that is that we people who make up these companies crave simple stories, and that's what leads me to Star Wars. So Star Wars, why do children get hooked on Star Wars? My son got into Star Wars and forced me to watch all 9 episodes and all the ancillary films. Well, I think initially it appeals to very simple, straightforward archetypes. So you've got this evil figure who wears only black, and you can't see a person behind his clothes or his sort of cyborg outfit. And goodness is personified in Leia and Luke, who wear white, who have very open faces. They're young, they're good looking. They're good. To us, they're good. And you don't need any explanation. You just start watching the film, and suddenly you know who the goodies are and who the baddies are. It's very easy to follow. But the interesting thing about Star Wars, and the interesting thing I found, was that as my son found as he grew up, your interest is sustained by the realization that this simple idea of good and evil being located in these two characters has a more complex story behind it. And so you look back at, you find out over the course of the 9 episodes that Vader becomes bad because of a series of events, and a combination of those and his character. His young, youthful talent exceeded his wisdom, and he was impulsive and ambitious, and various tragedies befell him, and pressures resulted in him moving to the dark side, or becoming this figure that appeared to be completely and unabashedly evil. And we grow to realize towards the quite moving scene at the end that he's more human than he appears. His apparent competence and behind this apparent competence was a kind of loss of control. And at the end, he's literally unmasked and revealed to be this sort of human figure with, emotion, quotes, normal emotions, and it has a human face and a voice and so on. Similarly, Luke's development is from simple to complex. So he starts with a very simplistic view of the world that's very similar to a child's, good and evil, and then it becomes more nuanced with his experience. In fact, he becomes scared of his own power and emotion as he grows older. So these sort of simplistic ideas become more complex. And if you read up on, well, I'm sure many people have here read up on sort of complex theories of ambiguity in Star Wars morality, where the rebels are the bad guys and the Empire are the good guys. Unfortunately, this is quite unexplored by Disney, but to me, it's where all the interesting stuff is. So that's Star Wars, very simple idea of good and evil and appealing to children. And Kleinian Psychoanalysis, which I'm going to try and do justice to in the few minutes I have, takes this view that human beings have a drive to relate. That's the sort of fundamental aspect of them. And we relate to everything the way we relate to key life relationships. Klein was a follower of Freud, and she built on some of Freud's works with a closer look at how children worked. And she pointed out that the self and the other are intrinsically related. You cannot have one without the other. But what happens with children is that they have good and bad feelings, and they separate these out into externalized and internalized objects, focal points for feelings to be projected onto, like a Vader figure or a Leia figure. So like a simplistic mummy good, daddy bad kind of process. And Klein's view of healthy development was that as a child grows, it has the capacity to acknowledge bad aspects of the self as well as good ones, and also bad aspects of supposedly good figures as well as the good ones. You get this sort of balanced view of the objects of your psyche. So it's my contention that companies are like people. Companies have selves and others that they create as part of their internal narrative, which of course reinforced by the stories we tell ourselves about, we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and literally, that's what people say in many companies, or they've got it all figured out and we haven't. So they split off good, project them onto others, and bad and interject into themselves. And the reverse, as I mentioned, can also be true. We are the good guys and they are the bad guys. So maturity requires an acceptance of nuance, that nothing is purely good or bad. So what does this have to do with cloud native transformations? Well, my argument is that these narratives create a self-reinforcing block. So companies that think of themselves as bad, which many do, use that as an excuse to avoid confronting the kind of everyday realities of change that they have. Obviously, they're a business that's functioning and is able to make a profit. So they're actually pretty good, a lot better than most businesses that fail. So they have to accept that they're both good and bad before they can actually move to a place where they can change. This sort of change, as I say, requires an acceptance of nuance and difficulty. And people and companies don't want to confront this truth. And the fact that they don't want to is partly why existential crisis is such a common pattern for change in an organization. When you have no choice but to look at yourself and demand that something changes, then it's much easier to let go of your inhibitions and do it. But if you're not in a crisis, then you're going to have to actually stop thinking of things as good, purely good or purely bad, and actually accept the nuance. So to conclude, if you want a transformational change, you need to move beyond the idea of ideal others and bad selves, or good selves and bad others, and accept that change will be difficult, that all companies struggle with it, and that the reality is always more nuanced than the blog posts and the stories we tell ourselves are telling us. And if you keep talking honestly, then your chance of success will be greater as you work through the difficulties. And that's it. That's my talk on Star Wars and cloud native transformation. Thank you.
Yay. Thanks so much, Ian. Yeah, are there any questions? I'm checking the chat right now. Doesn't seem to be. I mean, it was very clear, so I'm sure people were just, they don't have any questions. There's also nothing controversial at all. So that's probably.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Liam.
You'll be hanging out on Umbrella, right?
I am, yes.
Cool.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. So then any kind of like fights you want to have with Ian, you can have on Umbrella.
Yeah, you can persuade me that Star Wars is great and I should watch them again.
Oh, God, no, it's fine. It's fine. They're not that great. Okay, I'm getting a hand signal. I think I'm supposed to say goodbye. Okay.
Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.